Hello, hello. It's the Japan Zoominar. It's January 24th, 2023 in the United States. And where I am in Tokyo, it is actually January 25th. Ohayou gozaimasu from Tokyo, and good afternoon on the West Coast, good evening, wherever else you may be. This is the Japan Zoominar at UC San Diego. I'm Ulrike Schede, professor of Japanese business at UC San Diego and the director of JFIT, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. This finds you at UC San Diego's School of Global Policy and Strategy, GPS. We have a large number of degrees and a Japan-specific specialization. If you're interested in our offerings, please go to gps.ucsd.edu. And JFIT is our Japan Center. The website is jfit.ucsd.edu. If you go to that website, you can see our news and media tab where you can sign up for our newsflash, as well as the Japan Zoominars tab where you can sign up for past recordings. Yes, this is correct. This Zoominar is going to be recorded and will be available online. You can find past links at this tab, Japan Zoominars. Later on in our conversation, you're invited to type any questions you may have into the Q&A box. If I relay your question to our speaker today, I will refer to you only by your first name. I will also share all questions asked with the speaker after the event, so they will know who you are, but not for the recording. So we'll have Yves Tiberghien today, and I'll introduce him momentarily. But let me point out that on February 7th, we have Sarah Lubman, who's a journalist and has just written a piece in the National Geographic on aging in Japan, and she'll talk to us about that piece. And then on February 21, we'll have my dear colleague and friend Takeo Hoshi, who will discuss with us, probably at that time, the new governor of the Bank of Japan has been announced, and he will bring his crystal ball and tell us what that might mean. All righty, with that, let me share. Let me stop my share, and here's the speaker. Hello, Yves, how are you? Thank you for joining me this morning, this afternoon. Hello to Canada.
Hello, Rico. Great pleasure.
So Yves Tiberghien is a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia in wonderful, beautiful Vancouver. He's also the Konwan Kai Chair in Japanese research. So he's a political scientist who studies Japan. He has a large number of titles. Yves, allow me to point out only two: Distinguished Fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada and Senior Fellow at the University of Alberta's China Institute, which is important because we're going to talk a little bit about China today as well. He's a regular visitor at Tokyo University, Sciences Po in Paris, and Taiwan and anywhere else. He is a comparative political economist and studies also the global economic environmental governance. His PhD is from Stanford, and he has written many, many books, including last August, he published the East Asian COVID-19 Paradox, which I'm sure you will tell us about today, which is what we have you here. He also has a book in 2007 titled Entrepreneurial States, which is a comparative political economy book. So Yves, let me stop here. If you wanted to add anything to your bio, feel free. I understand you brought some PowerPoints, so why don't you start us off to this afternoon with a quick tour de force through how COVID is playing out in the various Asian countries and context.
Thank you, Ulrike, and I'll take this chance to greet many friends that I saw in the list. I had a quick look, and friends, mentors, and one of the editors of the Cambridge Element book as well. So hello to all of you. So I'm going to show a couple slides, and then we'll get into the discussion. All right, here we go. So it's an ongoing story. The COVID is never done. It's a saga that keeps changing through different variants and etc. So you probably also this is the moment. I want to acknowledge first the enormous toll, death, and pain of so many people around the world over 3 years now, as well as the mental health impact and loss of freedom and vision for so many of our students and young people and beyond. So this was the Cambridge element that came out in August 2021. So based on data that was up to February 2021, so it's pre-Delta and pre-Omicron, but we're talking of a new version. And the general puzzle was, there was a global puzzle. There's an aspect of global governance in there. Why did the global pandemic of limited mortality trigger the biggest lockdown in human history? And however, there was a comparative puzzle in there. Why did East Asian and Oceanian countries on average manage to limit mortality and economic damage better than the rest of the world in 2020 and early 2021? But then the additional questions come after the little book. Why did East Asia and Oceania then had experienced divergent path in 2021, 2022 under the Delta and Omicron variants? And then we are adding today a whole section on China. What has happened in China? Why did China dig down in this extreme zero COVID in 2022 and then give up all of a sudden with a massive U-turn in December? And then what are some implications of all that? So this is the key summary of different data. This is based on the publicly available data from our world in data from Oxford. And this is mortality outcomes, deaths per million. So there are limits. In some countries, they're undercounted, as we know, but this is the most reliable or the starting point for a conversation. And so the first column is at the end of year one, a COVID classic. Then what happened with Delta, then Omicron. By the summer, we saw pretty much where Omicron was going. And then I did another date count here, mid-December. And the story for the first two columns was that on average, North America, Europe, and South America got hit a lot more than East Asia and Oceania, and even India, South Asia. So that was the first story, and it's quite a big difference, right? After 1 year, we had 1,400 deaths per million in the US, 16 or almost 1,700 in the UK, but we were, between 0 and 100 in the entire East Asian region. So it's a pretty dramatic difference in the first year. Then Southeast Asia got hit pretty badly by Delta. So there was a big increase during Delta, Malaysia being the worst hit. And then when it came to Omicron, the worst hit became Hong Kong. And that was last February, April 2022, and went to 1,245 deaths per million. Now it's almost 1,500. It's half of US, Europe levels, but it's high by East Asian standards. Malaysia stayed where it is. And then we saw under Omicron, every country going up. So everybody went into 300-400. There's been mortality everywhere, including Japan. But the one that's held the best, in a way, has been Singapore. And then Taiwan on average. And then Japan was actually a laggard relative to East Asia in the first two phases. And then by Omicron became the second best performer after Singapore. So that's an interesting, the relative rankings within Asia. Now, when it comes to Indonesia, Philippines, for sure, the data is undercounted. So that complicates any comparative numbers. Now, you see China was flat throughout. The initial 3 was probably a 10 based on what we know from Wuhan, but then it stayed flat. And then December, I'll talk soon about what's happening, but essentially China is most likely to follow what has happened in Hong Kong. So we could go as high as 1,500 deaths per million, or something in between. Vietnam is at 400, undercounted for sure. So it's it's going to end up between 800 and 1,400 deaths per million. Which means between 1.5 million and 2 million by the end of the spring, based on comparative data. The big puzzle was that we had a pre-pandemic pandemic preparedness index that was organized by GHU and the global, the Economist Intelligence Unit, and they ranked, based on many criteria, which country should do better if a pandemic hit. That was done in fall 2019, and then lo and behold, that's after 1 year. There were some expected high performers at the time: Japan, Korea. Those were highly ranked. Thailand. And then there were some super achievers, those who did much better than the ranking would have predicted. And then very big underperformers, and at the time was Switzerland, Sweden, France, US, UK, Spain, in fact, much of Europe. And then medium performer included Indonesia, Austria, India, probably versus the official data. So it was very, very interesting how the ranking did not predict what would happen, at least in the first year or two. Omicron will shuffle the cards quite a lot. And so what I argued in the element, the Cambridge element, was the variable that seemed to explain the difference and the overperformance by East Asian cases was institutional capacity, but in a targeted way. That is, the pre-existing targeted centralized governance structures that were put in place and legal tools for pandemic response. And this is one level below political regime. It actually cuts across regime types. And one of the dimensions was a centralized headquarter that would coordinate all activities and be very reactive. All of the cases triggered their response tools and their headquarters in January 2019, except Japan, which was slower, and whatever got triggered was later in March. The second variable is social cohesion. So there was high level of social cohesion and social trust in terms of common peril, as measured ex ante through world valued surveys and other things, but weaker when it came to vaccine development. So by 2021, when the vaccine became the key, here Asia was more of a laggard, except for the case of China, Taiwan, Vietnam, and India, but those vaccines were not as efficient as the mRNA. So Japan, very interestingly, was a little different from all the other East Asian cases. The response was mostly through informal governance. There was not a triggering of a strong set of institutional tools. It was more 3C guidelines and reliance on strong social cohesion and social response to guidelines, which is higher than in other countries, as well as the protection of long-term senior care homes, as shown by Esteves Abe. So some assets, but not the same thing as what Taiwan or Korea or Singapore were doing. Interestingly enough, most Japanese in 2021, that was during Suga, felt that the government should have done more. And so that came on top in the Pew survey here, whereas in Taiwan, it was the opposite, right? So it was very interesting, the divergence here within East Asia. And then again here, Japan stands out along with Korea, but in opposition to Singapore, Taiwan, in having a sense of great divisions after the pandemic. That was 2021, and all this lays the foundation for the fall of Suga, actually. But Suga was mostly unlucky because the time when he had to make his decision was the time when Delta was peaking, and the numbers were really growing fast, and the vaccination rate was catching up. But he was caught. He just was out of a month or two. If he had 2 months more, the numbers would have reversed, and Kishida inherited the fall of Delta cases and the good vaccine rates by that point. What's interesting in 2021 is, is that Kishida then did the reverse of East Asia. While East Asia was softening up after being very harsh, Japan did the reverse and started hardening, assuming worst case scenarios and increasing hospital beds to some extent, and then closing the borders eventually. We can leave the discussion of Japan later. The big story about Omicron is that Omicron was a whole different game. It's not the same COVID because it's much less lethal, but it's much more transmissible. So what worked in 2020 doesn't work anymore. Plus, the society and the economies are exhausted. And so initially there was divergence, and it started with Delta, but we find Korea, Australia, Singapore, they open and living with COVID. On the basis of high vaccination. There is slower opening in Hong Kong, Taiwan, New Zealand, but gradually they're forced to accept. Japan had a more robust response and more robust than during the rest of the pandemic. That was interesting. And China doubled down on a very harsh enforcement of zero COVID with no exit strategy in sight and essentially a huge economic shock. So that was the main story. And what we learned during Omicron is that there are new variables. And the Omicron response, in a way, depends on a bunch of variables like the level of public support for government policies in the previous phases and the level of trust in government, how much is holding or not. Continuing levels of social cohesion, where there's more divisions, the government has to change policy. The economic social pain, the vaccination situation, and of course, the age situation within this population. So those variables become different from the variables that were critical in phase one. Now I'm turning to China. What exactly is going on, right? This is an incredible and very, very dramatic situation. And we want to know what's happening. How does it fit in a larger picture? Why was irrational zero COVID so entrenched in 2022 and then abruptly abandoned? What will be the impact? And so when we unpack China, there are really four phases. It's like four cases. There was a case of delay and political suppression at the very beginning, then a case of massive mobilization of health capacity and party cell, but with the inclusion of health specialists and therefore some technocratic capacity that is most similar to the other East Asian cases, but with harsher enforcement. Phase three became a deep entrenchment. And at that point, the health specialist, a sideline, at least the most respected one, and it becomes purely politicized in the context of the party Congress, with enormous cost across the board, especially human cost. There's also fragmentation within the country as local governments all start doing their own thing. And so the country is fragmenting across regions and local governments. And then phase four is the abrupt Uturn, the massive mega wave, the biggest anywhere in the world at any point in the pandemic. That's the best data we can have today. They are not official data, but this is from Affinity, it's a private firm that has been pretty good throughout the COVID pandemic. They estimate that we have daily deaths in China right now, this is as of today, of 35,000. Cumulative cases, they say 129 million, and cumulative deaths since December 1st, 848,000. This is not acknowledged by China, and China is, of course, hiding the data. The only way we'll have the data will be through excess mortality studies in the future. So this is pretty dramatic. They estimate that there will be probably about 1.7 million dead by April, which is close to my comparative, analysis based on other countries. So, however, the good news is they are peaking around January 13th, maybe right now at the end of Chinese New Year. And so we're going down after that. And the vaccine situation, of course, underlies a lot of the story. We know that China had not mRNA, inert vaccine, not the mRNA vaccine, which is less good. However, good comparative studies out of Hong Kong and Singapore showed that the Chinese vaccine works as long as you had a booster. So when you had 3 doses, it seems to be almost as good as mRNA, with 90% protection against death and severe disease. But without the booster, the protection is less than 40%. The other condition is the booster has to be within 6 months. However, the 2-dose rate was unchanged for almost the whole year. And then so it was high at 89, 90%, which is similar to Singapore, etc. But that was all achieved in 2021. There was no change in 2022. And then the booster rate was flat, essentially at 56, 57% in the whole of 2022, and is only at 58% now. And with elderly people, it's lower, particularly in urban centers. So the urban elderly vaccination rate is 30 to 40%. And that's the reason why mortality is so high right now. So in first phase, we know the causality was blame avoidance by local government, and they were distracted also by it's not actually party Congress, by the provincial Congress, government Congress of Hubei and Wuhan. And so they were suppressing, delaying, etc. In phase 2, there was full central mobilization of health bureaucracy, CCP, etc., national mobilization, relatively high spirits, and relative similarity to other East Asian cases. And then they entered the zero COVID trap, where there's extreme politicization. There was an advisory committee with respected people from the health community and policy community, including some that are well known internationally, that advised in March or February, actually, to open up gradually by the summer, saying that Omicron could not be contained. And it was overruled by the Politburo. Everything was in the name of the party Congress. And there was an extreme amount of fear in the system. All local governments acted based on fear, which, resembles a bit the campaign style of the Great Leap Forward. So whatever the cost, they would, shut down, lockdown, etc. There was a game-changing moment in Shanghai, maddening lockdown throughout the summer, accelerating in September, October, November. It was like everyone was thinking, what is going on? We can't live this way, except for the elderly population, which sort of thought it was good. They were safe, and so there was a split in the population here. And then this complete electronic control, including the red elites themselves that got control through those apps. Then abrupt Uturn. Yes, there's a trigger of the protests, but most likely that's not the real cause. The real cause is the bankruptcy of local governments that exhausted all their resources doing testing and had no more money. Some local governments have not been paying doctors and nurses for a few months. Then the economy was in free fall. The growth is probably below the 3% that's official now. And there was also diplomatic re-engagement, especially with Europe, and a lot of very frank discussions from Europeans, but probably Biden, probably others, about the reality, what was happening, and about Omicron. So maybe Xi Jinping got some information finally after blocking information for so long. The enduring puzzle is why vaccines were not accelerated. And there is a dimension of economic nationalism, the refusal of having foreign vaccine. But it's something more fine-grained. There was deep mistrust by especially elderly people in China, and an unwillingness of the party to force them physically to have something they were refusing. There was also the fact that China was trapped by its own political rhetoric before the party Congress. Since it was announced everywhere that they were safe and there was no COVID, no one is motivated. There's no sense of urgency to get the vaccine. And so they are trapped in a narrative in a way. And there is general mistrust on vaccine that's longer than COVID. Then why the abrupt U-turn and not a gradual one? Probably it was already out of hand. COVID was already spreading below the surface in many places. And so it was actually impossible to engineer a gradual U-turn. And also there may have been the factor of fear of the protests, which were mentioned many times by Xi Jinping in various meetings. What are the consequences for China? Clearly, there's public puzzlement and mistrust. You could talk to a lot of Chinese people right now, at least the middle-class types, and they all like, this was incompetence. There's a general demonstration of something that really blew up, a great policy failure. There's also a health scar that's going to exist here because a whole group of people are dying at the same time, mostly above 80 years old. But this is abrupt and painful. For young people, there's a burst of opening and liberation. There is a question of international trust and impact on soft power, clearly very bad. But maybe, like after the Cultural Revolution, there's a chance of a toning down of propaganda because no one wants to take propaganda right now, and maybe a return of pragmatism. But that could be just a hope on my part. So that's it for some basic data. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you. That's a fantastic tour de force through all of this. I'm glad we have a recording so we can go back to your terrific PowerPoints. And I'm also glad to hear that you're updating that book because I think this is really important. And of course, the challenge is always if you write about something that's happening right now, it's hard. So a few questions, and then I'll I invite the audience to join this conversation by way of typing your questions into the Q&A, and I will try to weave this into our conversation. There was something on the last slide that immediately caught my attention. You mentioned that the high death rates and the deep losses of grandparents, parents, the elderly, will shape culture. Can you say a little bit more about what you think this U-turn, maybe it wasn't even a U-turn, right? So as you just said, maybe there was already something going on, but apparently, I mean, it looks from the distance as if it was more important for the government to make sure there are no protests than to ensure the health of the nation, right? So that's a pretty harsh choice there. So how will it shape culture in China if you had to?
Well, yeah. So when I thought of the aspect of shaping culture, is it's to a lesser extent I have in mind the Great Leap Forward, because you could see it in graphs, right? It's something that has affected every family. The Great Leap Forward, of course, is much greater and led to 30 to 50 million dead, but it profoundly shaped all kind of writings and all kind of the thoughts and all the culture that's allowed. It's very profound. So here, if we could have up to 2 million people dying almost within 2 months. And what's also dramatic is that the country was officially safe, that there was no COVID, and there was a narrative that they had found a superior method, and everyone sort of, well, except the young people, but a lot of people came to believe in it. And there was an army of cadres working for it, and they worked day and night, right? And they were very dedicated to it. And so there was a narrative, there was a whole system, there were dedicated people. They thought they worked for the good of the country. And then overnight, without any warning, it's gone. And so first of all the dabai, all the people in white suit, they lose their jobs. And those were usually people at the lower, they were not highly qualified people. They're people maybe were unemployed, etc. So they were in power. Or cleaning, in buildings, you had cleaning ladies that suddenly became the dabai that could check all the green codes and could order people and could send them to quarantine. Enormous power. So overnight, that group is out of job. And they're hated by everybody. It's a bit like those reversals after the Cultural Revolution. You also have overnight, the fact that it happened so fast, and people were not allowed to stockpile medicine for the previous 2 years, like cold medicine, fever medicine. Nobody was ready. So then people feel, caught off guard. Nobody was prepared for this, right? It's just like, what's happening? And the fact that there was such a powerful narrative that this shouldn't happen, and then it happens, that is a shock, right? And everybody, I've watched some groups, some conversations that some of the conversation cut across China and groups in North America, right? Because a lot of those communities, like alumni communities, are integrated. There's a lot of chatter about all this, a lot of chatter about, like, oh my, because also they suffered during zero COVID. This was maddening. You could be quarantined, you could be locked down instantly, with half an hour notice, and for 7 days, and you had no food or whatever, and several times, and you had to test every day. Your life was taken over, but they thought it was for a purpose. And overnight, that was abandoned. So there's a lot of purpose. People are reckoning with all this, right? This is a pretty deep experience. Mm-hmm.
So it's so interesting, the stark difference. So in Japan, and we want to get to Japan eventually, but correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the Japanese government never issued a "you must wear a mask" directive. It was just, we will all wear masks, right? Let's all wear masks. And of course, everybody did. And so you turn this into, it's not voluntary, of course. I mean, the Japanese don't like masks more than anybody else. I mean, it's this myth about, which is probably not true, but yeah, so there's a mask culture here, and people wear masks, and they're more used to it anyway, and it's warm in the winter, and and it's hay fever season coming, so we're going to do this anyway. But there's this stark difference about Japan doing this more in a quote unquote voluntary way, and China having to pull hardcore surveillance measures. What explains the difference?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So on the Japanese side, well, it's well known that a lot of things operate through guidelines. It's not just this, but and it's well known that people follow guidelines. So for some, there's different motivators, but one motivator, of course, is care for, for other members of the family, other neighbors. And so there's actually, that's the social trust, the social care. But there's also an aspect of shame, or you don't want to appear in front of someone and you did the wrong thing. I had a discussion, I was in December in Japan and teaching in Todai. We had a discussion about this in the class. And some people were saying, well, masks in the end are still the least intrusive and they work. But others were saying, that means we're watching each other. What culture wants that, right? We're like, all of us are doing it 100% because we're afraid of each other. It creates this mutual watching. Right? So there was an interesting debate about it. But so that's that. Now, I was struck in December that it was 100% wearing in Tokyo, right? Outdoor and indoor. Everywhere outdoor, it was 100%. But I hear that a new guideline will come out in the spring, right? But it will come from Kishida-san, and then eventually it will spread everywhere. And now the enforcement, however, could be, companies or maybe schools had more formal guidelines, more forceful guidelines. So even though the Prime Minister did not order everybody, some organizations had much more firm guidelines, right? So that's the Japanese story. On the Chinese side, it's a mixture. Yeah, there was some extreme control, and that's the tools they used. In a way, the easiest tool that they had is a mixture of low-tech. So the low-tech part was testing everywhere with those booths with pretty low-skills persons that were just there and did not exactly know how to do it, actually. And also the quarantine centers or the fever centers, they were pretty low-tech and built in a very simple way. So those are pretty low-tech containment measures, along with the more high-tech apps that were developed by Tencent and Alibaba for the government. And however, they sometimes crashed. Like in August, one night, the Sichuan province computer center crashed and everybody had no more code. And so nobody could go out, nobody could go shopping, but it was fixed later. So it's a mixture of an early experiment in control through phones and with low-tech tools. But on the vaccine side is not as high-tech. And then they did not use the same coercion to force the vaccination. That's always, the contrast is fascinating, right? They felt, even Xi Jinping himself said, it's very hard to force elderly to vaccine. They don't want to do it. It came from the top. They felt they couldn't do it. It's just interesting to note that, right? That they felt it was easier to send an order through an email or through WeChat groups. Every residential group is in a WeChat group. They can order people to stay home, and they can change the color of the code on their phone. So it's intrusive and non-intrusive, but they didn't do physical stuff as much. It's very interesting. But with Omicron, that couldn't work anymore. And if they had not sidelined the doctors, early, in 2022 and listened to those expert committees, they would have known that. But they ducked down for political reason.
So the questions are coming in, and we have two invitations for you to talk about two additional countries, Taiwan and India. I don't know in which order would work better. So can you maybe give us a little bit more flavor of the comparatives here?
So Taiwan is one of those, along, for example, Vietnam or Korea, or even Thailand, where the first year was a miracle, right? Extremely efficient. And I'm going to say a few more things on this. And then 3 years later, you find in the local elections in Taiwan that the government is punished partly for the COVID policies. Same in New Zealand. The Prime Minister got harassed and is exhausted. She was a hero in 2020, and Jacinda Ardern just resigned because she's exhausted, and also her party has lost a lot of support. In Korea, the switch was faster. So it shows there is no mercy in politics, but dealing with COVID is painful from a political perspective, right? All the heroes of 2020 have been suffering in 2022. So specifically on Taiwan was probably, and in the book is sort of the hero. This is like the perfect case, the ideal case. In 2020, they did everything right. So they were very organized to start with. They had laws on the book, and they had created even an empty floor on top of a building above the CDC that was for pandemic headquarters. and they could trigger it in one day. And the pandemic headquarters had on the books the authority to order all the ministers, coordinate with every ministry, and to order the production of masks, to order the production of tests. And so by early February, they were ramping up masks, they're ramping up tests. Everything was happening, right? And they had shut down the borders. They triggered that pandemic headquarters on January 20, and they were like going on 5 cylinders, right? And you contrast that to Europe, North America, where nothing was happening until March. And, there's such it's pretty amazing. They were the example to follow. They're not the only one. Singapore, Vietnam, Korea, the great Mongolia started their pandemic headquarters on January 18, right? So by the way, that shows how the US or Europe were not watching. Even if we don't pay attention to China, at least we should pay attention to all those allies in the region that got it right? And New Zealand and Australia followed, which is very interesting. So the Oceanian countries followed. By the end of January, they were doing the same thing. And then Taiwan did also some use of data. They had an app, and they managed to merge database between the healthcare data and the immigration data. So by early February, if you go to see a doctor and you say, I didn't travel, the doctor knows if you traveled. It's a bit intrusive in terms of privacy, but the laws on the book had a lot of protection to make sure that all this would be very temporary and will be eliminated later. So we haven't seen as much of a backlash in Taiwan as we have seen in Korea, Singapore on this more, intrusive data. And then, so in general, year 1 is beautiful. And then in year 2, they got hit by Delta in the spring. And so there's quite a bit of cases, but the mortality just goes to 30 per million. So by Taiwanese standards, it's huge, but by the US, which was at that point 2,200 or something, it's very low. And then, however, they got hit because the vaccines were slow. And that's because Taiwan wanted to do its own vaccines first. And they didn't want to import Pfizer through China. And Pfizer had a contract with Shanghai, and that would cover Taiwan. So there was a whole political battle there going on. And eventually in September, when they get a whole bunch of Pfizer BioNTech vaccines, they come through a private deal by Foxconn. Foxconn rescues the government here. And then the Taiwanese vaccine also rolls out. But there was a delay there. And it was, by 2022, people were tired of all this. That's why they punished the government in the local election. No mercy. Voters are tough, right? Everywhere. Korea is even more dramatic example of this. And as for Vietnam, you probably read in the news, the president just resigned, and the foreign minister was about to resign, or the 2 vice premiers have resigned and been fired, and it all for corruption around the testing kits of COVID. So COVID generating huge flow of resources. We have similar stories in China. There is some, because all the money went to test boost and test kits, and there's going to be corruption scandals pretty soon. And there are rumors already. But Vietnam is rocked by that after being highlighted by WHO in 2020 as one of the 7 best countries dealing with COVID. What a saga, right? COVID is a tough thing.
Well, I actually heard
India,
that.
I can say a word on India.
Go to India. Okay.
So India did okay in the first year, not as as fully organized as pandemic headquarters and all this as East Asian cases, but the numbers initially coming in were not too bad. There was some stringency in measures, some quarantine measures and all this, and lockdown, and then they had this explosion with Delta. So that was the spring 2021. And this was accelerated by votes, by elections and huge meetings that sometimes had 1 million people. And then there was a lot of lockdown quarantines, which really destroyed the livelihood of people, and then eventually a reopening. But India had an advantage in doing the production of vaccine for AstraZeneca. So they were able to roll out vaccine within 2021. By now, India is like 80% vaccine, and then they have good booster rate at above 70%, I think, from what I saw. Well, the data officially is just 500 deaths per million. The reality's got to be at least double that or more. But they end up being in the murky middle, not the level of deaths that we have seen in the US or Europe, but not as good as the East Asian vanguard.
So we have a number of questions on society and politicians here, and also international relations. Maria wonders how the ego and pride of individuals in power supersedes the humans that are supposed they're representing, which is, of course, the dilemma in many places. But on the China situation, our colleague John, who's a famous Japan literature professor, asks the following: Japan translates everything, but there's no Japanese translation of Fang Fang's Wuhan diary, he thinks. Question mark. If true, is this because of the Japanese government's fear of offending the PRC? Because there's actually an English translation by Michael Berry, which encountered heavy headwinds. Do you know anything about that?
Oh, yeah, the English I've heard of, but I don't know the story as to why the book was not published in Japan. That's very interesting. I assume it's going to be published, right? I mean, there's still a free book production system, because at this point in 2020, especially under Abe, but even early Suga, there was a lot of care with the PRC. So Japan was slow to shut down border. And, this is the year where they expected Xi Jinping to visit even, and it was not officially canceled for months, right? Yes. And they had been, December 2019, Prime Minister Abe was in China for the Korea, Japan, China summit, the CJK summit. And there was a lot of good stuff going on, and they laid the foundation for RCEP. By the way, RCEP is another puzzle that I emphasize in the book, is how could, in the middle of a pandemic that's dividing the world, and there's more and more of a Cold War developing between the US and its allies and China, how could so many Western allies sign RCEP in November 2020 in the midst of a pandemic that's devastating the region, or the world at least? So that's an interesting side aspect to it. But the foundations for that were laid through some of the good economic, pragmatic relationship that Abe had developed with China. So that was still the mood in 2020. And it's only late 2021, especially under Kishida, that everything tips over and we move to to much more national economic security, etc. And then the Ukraine war is the ultimate tipping point, and we have a completely different situation now between Japan and China. So at this point, I don't think Japan would bother to do anything not to offend China, right? The ship has left and it's gone so far. So that's a good question. But on Maria's question, it is true that the pandemic everywhere in every country has changed pecking order of people, have enabled new people to be in power. All kind of people had control over other humans, and then all kind of people were proved wrong, other people were proved right. So, and then there was in general massive mental health shock on everybody. And then each phase of COVID changes the game entirely. And then so in the case of China, those things are very dramatic. Yeah, a lot of people were in power in the fall, and then now completely crestfallen. So there's a lot of stuff going on like this at the human level.
So let's talk about Japan, since it's a Japan Zoomina. So you mentioned Prime Minister Suga was really out of luck. I recall he was in office for just 1 year, right? And towards the end of that first year, there was this spike. Why would people even blame politicians for this? I don't understand. I mean, this is a global health thing. Is it easy to blame the politician, or do people sense that somebody's got to take the blame, or is Japan a little bit special in this, that voters can get really, I mean, they always vote for the LDP, but in surveys, they give their prime ministers these horrible ratings, right? And then I've always been puzzled by this. And I think the whole Suga thing brought this to the fore, that everybody gave him back ratings, but then when he left, everybody said, well, he wasn't that bad. So can you talk a little bit more about this public opinion game that's played here?
Yeah, so they were good. There was good research on this by Rieko Kage, by Kenneth McIlwain, Todai, even Harukata Takenaka. But myself, I was tracking if you track the cabinet support rate and then the cases of COVID, it's even the cases, not even the mortality. In year 1 and 2 of COVID, they track very closely. And in the summer 2021, that's when the Delta wave is rocking, initially Taiwan, and then it's rocking Southeast Asia. Malaysia loses control, Thailand loses control, Myanmar loses control after doing a good first year, but it's also the coup. And then that wave, comes really to Japan and is going exponential in July and August. And it's just the time, late August, that's the moment where Suga has to decide to run for the LDP race or not. And he will make that decision September 1 or 2. And that wave, you're right, is correlated to the wave across Asia of Delta. However, there is this extreme high correlation in Japan between the support rate and the opinion toward the cabinet and the cases, and that will only get disconnected under Kishida. And initially it's tracking. So when Kishida is shutting down border, is cracking down, is doing many things, but he's also lucky because the vaccination rate reaches 80% in his first 2 months, right? So the people are protected. So his support rate goes up. And then, he shuts down the border and then people are cheering. And then he keeps doing things, perfectly according to what the people want. And so from about April, or just in the lead up to the upper house election, we start to see that concern about COVID drops off and the correlation is broken. And at that point, it's not, I was looking at the data in May and June. And so COVID was not anymore salient for the election. It was falling below 10% of salience, and there were all the other things above. And that was new, very different from before. So Kishida succeeded by, in a way, he over-responded to Omicron to correct what had happened on the Suga because he had been watching, and it worked. Now on Suga, what Suga did great was to have Kono Taro do the vaccination, right? And Kono Taro really accelerated, what has been a moribund purchase campaign and all this. And he really put the turbo on it. And he did as fast as was physically possible. So by October, everybody is getting vaccinated. And it worked, but, neither Kono got the credit, no Suga. And Kishida pocketed the credit.
So Ethan reminds us that the Olympics may have played into this as well.
Right.
That from hindsight, the Olympics didn't cost anything and it wasn't a problem. And maybe from hindsight, the decision to hold them was the right decision. But when Prime Minister Suga decided to hold them, Ethan recalls that the public here was quite upset that they thought that this was going to be the spreader. Here we are behaving well, we're doing all our masking, and we're letting all these people come in.
Right. So the opinion polls on the Olympics, 2 months, 1 month before were negative, right? They were like 55, we don't support, and 40, it's a good idea. It's not massive, but it was on the negative side. And by and large, and it held all the way to the Olympics. There was a sense that this was forced against the public preferences. And it was done really, we know what happened, right? It was a legacy from Abe. And for Abe, it's very much like the 64 Olympics, and it's very much it's a very Meiji conception of the state, right? This is going to give that sense of glory and status to the state. There was that very top-down vision. And now also when you interviewed people, they thought anyway, when the Olympics are going on, people will rally against it. I heard that even before, but talking to a lot of young Japanese, they were all upset about it, very upset. So that affected the support rate. But then the Olympics themselves, I think there was some pickup. I haven't seen the end of Olympics support rate, but it went up somewhat. But still, there was lingering, that was put on the negative ledger for Suga as he was considering running. It's a combination of things. But in the end, this Delta wave was not caused by the Olympics. If anything, it was run very competently, and it's good memories of the Olympics by everyone else outside Japan, and even, I guess, if people are honest, in Japan. But somehow it hurt Suga. Yes, the timing was so unlucky.
So David, who is in Tokyo, asked about something that you may have picked up in December or in the news, but it's kind of looking forward. His question is, what is your take on Japan's proposed reclassification of COVID as a flu? And how that will allow even the potential associated impact on normalization. Is this a smart move? Is this good public relations, or is this just another one of these kind of interesting routes out?
Well, we'll have to watch how the public responds, right? I think what I felt in Tokyo for the young people or the middle class, that's the middle-aged middle class, they're tired. They're really tired of the masking and everything. And we know this in North America, right? We have guidelines at my university to wear masks, and nobody is wearing them because they're exhausted, right? And Omicron, when you get to XBB, that's going to spread everywhere. Now it's spreading in Eastern US, not yet in California, but it's coming. The R naught, which is the number of people one person can infect, is at around 18. The initial Omicron, the initial COVID was like 2, and eventually 1.8. The current variants that are, for example, in China, BA7 and that kind of stuff, this is about 10. So already you can't stop it at 10, but 18 you can't stop it. So I think in a way, accepting that we're moving to an endemic stage like a flu is realism. That is to try to stop this. It has a huge mental health cost. It has a huge social cost. It has a huge economy cost. But there is a bit of a risk on the elderly side of the ledger. So there's always that generation conflict in some ways around. Omicron is bad for this because essentially young people will be fine, and yet they take a huge burden socially and economically, whereas the elderly are more vulnerable. So there is that dimension.
Yeah, so we had, you mentioned Margarita Estevezabe. We had her on the Japan Zoominar talking about this interesting phenomenon in this country that the elderly actually don't have that many cases because their homes there's a tradition of closing the doors to the elderly folks' homes more than the young people. So in Japan, the cases are young, and if I walk around the streets here, I can see why. Everybody's wearing the mask outside, but then they go into the restaurant, and
right.
but the restaurants here are still checking temperature, which I think is one of those things that's become a social right? So you go in and they put something on your wrist, and they want to know what your temperature is, which is, I don't know, that could be very smart. It's interesting to me that that Japan is actually taking a lot of measures that nobody has demanded. But it's almost like a restaurant's contribution to public safety is to take this temperature before they allow people in, which could actually work, I guess. So Hans has a question, has a series of questions actually. They're most like international relations, but since you're a political scientist, let's try. So he's wondering, this vaccine trade, and India and China have not bought the Pfizer vaccine, if I understand it correctly. And then the question is, and India in particular has also declined to meet U.S. companies' requests for legal protection. I mean, side effects on the shots and so forth. So they have their own homegrown or other versions, and the question is why. And there's also are these vaccines as efficient as you just showed? Can you talk a little bit more about these vaccines politics?
Yeah, and there's going to be more and more research on that. In fact, there's even a book that just came out on this, and that battle would keep going. A fascinating case here is Vietnam. And I'll say a few words on this. But essentially, everyone has realized that now vaccine is a very, very big deal. It's a big market. It's a big science and technology. It's also power related. And so a lot of countries, and that includes countries like China, India, Vietnam, and we'll see what Japan or Korea do. And even Taiwan has been thinking that way. They thought of it in terms of national security. They thought of it in terms of political economy, industrial policy, because now it's a bit like chips and it's like green tech. It's one of those technology that's become super important, and that will have a lot of impact on growth. So the strategy for Vietnam is to become a hub and to have everybody build their factories there. They also tried to develop their own, which they did, but it was not as efficient. So almost everybody is building a factory in Vietnam, like for cell phones. So this is one of the winners. For China, they were really thinking in terms of both national security and political economy and industrial policy, all of that. And so they have been working very, very hard on an mRNA, which is now going in stage 2 testing, but they thought it would be ready in time, and it's not been ready in time. But both because of trust on the data and because of the amount of money it represents, they're adamant to try to have it on their own. And I suppose it's the same kind of calculation on the India side, without the Cold War dimension, but they know they are 20+% of humanity, this huge market. Also, early on in 2021, when I attended those discussions on vaccines, the majority of, pandemic experts thought that mRNA vaccine was like a Benz. It was too expensive, too complicated to upload at the global level, to do 8 billion people very fast. Plus, it's costly. And so there had to be a cheaper version to be realistic for the whole planet. And that's why Africa lagged behind, right? And other places where there was not enough willingness. And Pfizer has made billions, right? And of course, Moderna as well, right? And so there's a lot of battle of, profits as well. And also both of them received money from the Trump administration. So there were constraints, right, on how they deal with foreign countries. And maybe we don't know all the constraints that they got into, because they each got 10 billions, which were crucial in developing that fast. That was also new. So there's a bit of industrial policy here going on. So it's a big game, and it's classic political economy and IR. Yeah, big stakes. It's going to be fun to follow.
Well, actually, this is a great note to end on. As everybody knows, we end our Zoominars on time, and people are already signing off because they have to go to the next meeting. So let's do the same. Yves Thibet, again, thank you so much. This was absolutely fantastic. I feel I'm much more informed about all of this, and we will look forward to the updated version of your book. Please write it fast. And I'm glad you're doing this research, because I think, as you just said, right, this is super important, and it will have trickle-down effects into areas of politics and society and business that we don't even know quite yet, right? In the meantime, everybody, please stay safe, wear your mask if you want to, and just who cares what the other people think? Because if you want to do it, right? That's the other thing that's emerging in Japan, actually. That there are a lot of people that say, I'll just do it. So I'm thinking there's some challenges with the social proofing concept in this country. I see a lot of people who do go against the grain here suddenly, which is another interesting topic to talk about. So thank you, Yves. And everybody stay well. In 2 weeks, we'll be back with Sarah Lippman, who is a journalist and has looked at how Japan is becoming a trailblazer in terms of the aging society. So I'll see you in 2 weeks. And thank you, Yves. And thank you, everybody, for your great questions. See you later.
Thank you, Ulrike, and thank you, everyone. Great pleasure.